And now we are going to talk about YCS Bologna. I mean, we've talked about my personal experience a lot yesterday. So if you missed that, if you missed essentially the YCS Bologna celebration stream, you can check out the VOD either on Twitch or it's also going to be up on YouTube. So you can go !YouTube. I have a VOD channel where every single VOD goes up. If in case you ever miss a Twitch stream, you can go subscribe to that. But basically today I don't want to talk that much about my personal experience at YCS Bologna, but rather take the time to recap the event just as a whole, like what's going on in the format, what happened at the YCS, what kind of decks did well, and so on and so forth, because this was the last YCS of the year. This is the last YCS of the year, and it's gonna be a little bit of a, like, the next couple weeks, maybe even months, like 1.5 months maybe, are gonna be relatively calm for Yu-Gi-Oh, right? It's gonna be kind of like this holiday season. The format is kind of ending, right? We don't have that many new things coming out. It's kind of like the format basically kind of ends here, right? And so I want to take a little bit of a recap. How was the format? Because there's been a lot of discussions throughout this format. It's no secret that this format is very, very wide, very diverse. Some people have voiced their criticism about that. And I just want to do a little bit of a retrospective on, what happened in this format. Was it good? Was it bad? And then we're also going to do, it is time. It's been a long time since we've done this, by the way. We're going to have a ban list discussion today, which is no particular reason. Like, I don't know when the ban list is going to happen, like whether they want to do one in December or if they want to wait till January or whatever. I have no idea. But the last ban list was like 3 months ago or something like that. And I think it's an interesting point to basically look at the format in retrospective and think how would we tackle this format on a potential ban list? But before we do anything of that nature, I want to just look at YCS Bologna, see what happened and all that kind of stuff, right? And so I have the spreadsheet open. Shout outs to Super Poludo for the spreadsheet. Once again, you can go, I updated the Twitch command as well. You can go !spreadsheet if you want to look at all this stuff yourself. And yeah, that's that. Digifox, thank you for the bits, appreciate that. Boyger DK, thank you for the 9 months. Smartimus Prime, thank you for the 4 as well, appreciate that. All right, so before we go into singular deck profiles, this is the, let me see if you can see it. I guess I just switch around. This is the top 64 deck breakdown. Let me see if I can find the overall one. I didn't prepare the overall deck breakdown. YCS Bologna Day 1 decks. Let me see if I can find that. I can. Okay, it doesn't include that much. It does not include that many different decks on this graph, which I guess is sad, but here we are. Textforge, thank you for the 4 months. Random, thank you for the 7. And Lionheart, thank you for the 4 months. Appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. This was the day 1 deck breakdown for YCS Bologna. It had Unchained and Rescue Ace as the 2 most represented decks, which I think was about to be expected. Still, 12% for the most represented deck is still historically relatively low. There's usually been more dominant decks like this in terms of representation, but like I said before, this format, I mean, literally the reason why I played Bestial Runic was because I thought like you could play a lot of different things in this format, and people agreed. People brought a lot of, I feel like a lot of people brought comfort picks to this event. So we had Unchained at 12%, Rescue Ace at 12%, Tier at 10%, Labyrinth at 7%, Pearly at 7%, Bestial at 4%, which I don't know what that means. I don't know if my deck is included there. I don't know if it's Dragon Links. I don't know if it's all the Bestial decks combined. I have a hard time believing that Bestial, like that Dragon Link, had 4% alone. Probably mashed together. Like Bestial, I don't know, the Bestial Horus deck, that kind of thing. I don't know exactly what this means. And then other was just a huge chunk of 48%, which is also like, that's a crazy high amount of pretty much anything, right? But that was the overall deck breakdown. Conversion into top 64 has some interesting things to look at. Rescue Ace with an amazing conversion rate, honestly, amazing conversion rate. throughout Swiss. Don't know what the exact reason for this is. Like you look at this and it's like Rescue Ace's matchups in this spread, they're like fine. You know, the Unchained matchups is aight. The Tier Limit matchup I don't think is particularly great, but also not particularly bad. Labyrinth is a bad matchup for it. Pearly is a fine matchup for it. It's just like, I think Rescue Ace out of these decks is like the one with the most balanced sort of matchup spreads, because it can win against pretty much anything. It's like the one deck that we've talked about this beforehand when Steven Santoli won the YCS with Rescue Ace. Rescue Ace is kind of ignorant in like a super diverse format, because what Rescue Ace does better than most other decks is just ignore what your opponent is doing and just freaking do your thing. And if you resolve Turbulence, you probably beat every deck in the format, right? Not every single one of them, but like most of them is like, you know, you resolve Turbulence, you probably win, right? And that is something that is valuable in a format where you can't really predict what you're going to play against in 12 rounds of Swiss and then a top 64 cut, which is overall 18 rounds, right? And that's, I think, the Rescue Ace strength is that no matter what you play against, you don't have to like prepare for specific matchups. You just go like Turbulence F, right? Is Turbulence plus the 4 spell and traps of Rescue Ace really that strong? It's the thing you have to realize about Rescue Ace is that its end board is not unbreakable. It doesn't make an unbreakable end board. It ends on like, usually, I mean, there's some versions that go crazier with like the Terahertz or the Jet Synchron into Synchro plays. Usually it's going to be like the pure Rescue Ace, which I think is also what Anthony played in the finals. Like there was no tuners or anything like that, no Cybers package. It just ends on like IP or SP, Hydrant, maybe Preventer, some sets. The board is not unbreakable. It's not one of those boards where you see it and you just basically scoop to it. But the thing that is like, Rescue Ace is just another one of those decks in 2023, similar to Unchained in that sense, that just makes a board that is pretty good. It requires your opponent to sink a lot of resources into outing it, but then the follow-up for the deck is just crazy. Right? The follow-up for Rescue Ace is insane. Like, if you don't kill Rescue Ace pretty much, you don't win the game. The only deck, unironically, the only deck that can maybe break a Rescue Ace board completely and still win after are like the decks that can go really over the top. Like, I've done it once with the Bestial Runic deck in Swiss, where I broke the entire board and my grind game was stronger than theirs after. But that was only because they played their turn 1 suboptimally. Well, it was not wrong for them to do it, but they made the proxy magician into Mud Dragon because they were trying to play around Imperm and Veiler on the Turbulence, right? Which, looking back, of course, against my deck, that's suboptimal because I don't play those cards, right? And so they made a weaker board to play around cards that were not in my deck, and that's why I was able to break it, because there wasn't no SP or anything like that, right? But usually it's just a mix of their end board. You need like, it's so many things you need to invest, right? You need to deal. They have a trap card that pops one of your cards. They negate one of your cards. They book one of your cards. They have SP into or IP into SP, so they banish one of your cards and all that. So essentially, if they resolve the full combo, you only have 1 or 2 cards left after trading with all their resources, and then they still have good follow-up. So that's usually how it wins, right? And on top of that, hand traps create a very, very weird dynamic for Rescue Ace, which this is ultimately all the things I've said right now. You're like, okay, why didn't you just play Rescue Ace then? The reason I didn't play Rescue Ace was because everyone knew about the power of Rescue Ace, and that is single-handedly the reason why, after Rescue Ace's release, we have transitioned from like a board breaker format into a hand trap format, because everyone knows Rescue Ace, if they resolve the combo, they probably win, and board breakers don't do enough against it, right? If your opponent has an SP Little Knight and all the Rescue Ace cards set up, even if you have something like evenly matched, right? You go to the battle phase, they go SP to save 2 of their monsters, they keep one of their cards, you can't kill them in main phase 2, end phase, SP and the monster returns. They have follow-up. They go like field spell, shuffle all back, do it all again. You can't really board break Rescue Ace. It's not really possible, especially because you don't know what version they're playing, right? Maybe they're playing Baron to negate evenly. Maybe they're playing the Terahertz thing to send the D-Save Worm to stop your evenly match, right? So it's not reliable to board break a Rescue Ace. Thrust and Talents are also not reliable against Rescue Ace, because if you go second, they might just use the trap cards first, right? That's what the good Rescue Ace players do, is they usually play, they usually use the trap cards first to not make your opponent's talents life, right? And so those kind of cards just aren't that good against Rescue Ace. And that has sparked a hand trap heavy format, right? A hand trap heavy format. And that is, funnily enough, at the same time, good for Rescue Ace and bad for Rescue Ace. Because it creates, and that is the reason why I didn't play Rescue Ace, is because it feels very gambly and it feels very arbitrary to play through hand traps with Rescue Ace, right? Like, if I'm playing, like, Rescue Ace, now that it has the Diabell Star cards, is incredibly consistent. I have had not a single Rescue Ace opponent that bricked against me doing the YCS. That simply doesn't really happen with the deck anymore. Unless you're Quantal. You can't really brick with Rescue Ace, right? You have just way too many starters. The thing is, the only real way to beat Rescue Ace is by hand trapping it, because the deck is weak to hand traps. The problem is, the dynamic is pretty much the following, and you will probably, if you've ever tested a bunch of games against Rescue Ace, you probably see what I'm saying here. One hand trap against Rescue Ace feels incredibly shaky, because Rescue Ace is a deck that has a whole lot of one-card combos, but it also has a whole lot of two-card combos that play through pretty much any one hand trap. If it doesn't matter which hand trap you open, whether it's Ash, Imperm, Veiler, Nib, it doesn't matter which hand trap it is. If they open a two-card combo like Diabell Star plus Normal Summon or anything like that, they play through one hand trap every single time, pretty much. If they do it right, you know, if they do it right, any two-card Rescue Ace combo plays through one of your hand traps. Like, it does not matter which one you draw, pretty much. However, where it becomes really, really scary is when your opponent draws two hand traps, right? The problem with that is that we are currently in a situation where there are good amounts of hand traps. Like, people have been playing a lot of Ash, Imperm, Veiler, and Nibiru, which is like a 12 hand trap foundation that a lot of people have been using to counter Rescue Ace. The problem with that, I can actually pull up the exact numbers in case you're interested. Let me see. So I'm pulling up the probability calculator as we speak. Just like, you know, if you play 12 hand traps and you want to draw 2, you have like it's like slightly less than 50%. Slightly less than 50% to draw 2 hand traps going second in your 5 cards, which is pretty much just a coin flip, right? If you're playing Rescue Ace against someone who's playing Ash, Veiler, Imperm, Nib, you're essentially coin flipping, which is something that, you know, fine, I guess, right? Like, okay, but it's not something that I personally was looking to do, really. It's slightly worse because duplicates don't work. That is true, although, I mean, Imperm and Veiler can work as duplicates. It's just Ash and Nib that don't work as duplicates, but you're technically right. It's slightly worse than 47 because if you draw double Nib or double Ash, they don't really function that well. So essentially, Rescue Ace, to me, it felt like a relatively gambly one, because even if I win the dice roll with Rescue Ace, I don't feel super safe. Because I know everyone in the room, or like a lot of people in the room, are playing pretty much those exact 12 hand traps, give or take. You know, some people play an extra one, some people play less, like 9. But usually, in every single deck, you would expect somewhere between 9 and 15 hand traps, pretty much. Because you can't really go much higher than 12 right now, because it's simply a matter of quality, right? Like, Imperm, Veiler, Nib, Ash are really good. Droll isn't really that great in the main deck right now. Mourner is like the next best one, I think. Like Mourner would be your number 13, 14, 15. Beyond that, there isn't really that much you can do, especially in context of Rescue Ace, right? Like Crow isn't great against Rescue Ace. Bystials aren't great against Rescue Ace. Like what are you gonna do? Like you can side Phantasme, which makes your odds better of drawing the other ones, but there isn't really much else you can do to combat Rescue Ace very well. With hand traps, right? Like, I mean, you can play your one of Gamma, yeah, but it's like they're not like good main deck options. That's what I mean, right? So this is like, I hope you get what I'm saying when I talk about Rescue Ace like that. It's like the good thing with hand traps in the format for Rescue Ace is that there aren't really enough hand traps to consistently stop Rescue Ace because most of the time people draw one hand trap. And Rescue Ace usually plays through that, right? But then still, there are enough hand traps in the format that people still often draw two, right? Like, it's like the average of hand traps that people open in this format is somewhere between 1 and 2. And it's just very arbitrary, because if your opponent happens to draw 1, you probably beat them. If your opponent happens to draw 2, you probably don't beat them, right? And that feels like something that... It's not wrong to take that Gamba, right? It's not wrong to play Rescue Ace. Rescue Ace is good in the format. It just, the reason why I personally don't like that is it feels like it doesn't give me a lot of agency as a player. Like, as someone who considers themselves a good player, I don't really get to decide the outcome of the game when I go first with Rescue Ace, because it's usually, it feels like it's decided based on, does your opponent draw the 2 hand traps or not, right? That is simply something that kind of threw me off with Rescue Ace, is that everyone had Rescue Ace on their radar. Everyone was playing hand traps to counter Rescue Ace, and I was just at the mercy of my opponent drawing those cards or not drawing those cards, right? And that's why I personally didn't like Rescue Ace, but that doesn't change the fact that Rescue Ace is a really powerful deck in this format. On top of that, I also felt like, I mean, we have to talk about Labyrinth here. Labyrinth coming through with an insane conversion rate into top cut. Like, they had 7% in the event, converting to 14, which is doubling their percentage, which is an even better conversion rate than freaking Rescue Ace had. Labyrinth was a deck that I think was exceptionally strong for this event, and we're going to look at some of the Labyrinth lists later and why they performed so well. I think it is also just a matter of Labyrinth was a deck, is one of the decks that is really rewarding to play, and I think a lot of really good players picked up Rescue Ace. Like we not Labyrinth, like we saw Dinkabui top 4 with Lab, we saw Yoho top 8 with Lab, Gabriel Nets top 8 with Lab. Like those, it's definitely, with this kind of deck, it's also the matter of the player a little bit. But I want to say the reason why I think Labyrinth was good for this tournament was quite simply the fact that it kind of breaks through. It breaks through what I just talked about. The problem with the hand traps in Labyrinth is Labyrinth has a very cool way of stopping or of countering that issue, because Labyrinth still plays those usually 9 hand traps, maybe 12. You could, depending on the version. But the thing with Labyrinth is it doesn't stop there. When you go second, you don't simply have those 9 to 12 hand traps. You have more than that, because you have so many combinations of Labyrinth cards that simply stop your opponent, or like interrupt your opponent just a little bit on their first turn, right? The lists now are playing like triple Arias, some amount of Ku-Klux, and yes, in order to disrupt your opponent with an Arias or a Ku-Klux play, those are like 2 to 3 card combos. But when you consider that pretty much every single 3-card combo of Labyrinth cards like interrupts your opponent a little bit now, suddenly the chances of opening that are pretty high. Like, you can draw Arias plus a trap card. You can draw a Ku-Klux plus a furniture. You can draw Arias plus Ariana to search the Ku-Klux and draw a furniture, or you can draw Arias, Ariana, furniture and search the Ku-Klux. You can draw something like you can draw furniture, big welcome, and lady, and that's a bounce on your opponent's turn, right? Yeah, like if you go furniture, discard big welcome, special lady, then you have a bounce, because you have the welcome in the big welcome in the graveyard and the lady on the board. You can bounce one, right? It's like there's like not just one combination that interrupts your opponent. There's like so many 2 to 3 card combos in Lab that throw just a little wrench into your opponent's plan. And the thing is, that alone doesn't stop your opponent. Like if I just have like, for example, Ku Klok plus Furniture, which is like the most obvious and simple way to disrupt your opponent. If you have just that, that usually isn't enough. That pops one card, right? It pops one card, but now this is where like you pair this with one hand trap and suddenly it stops Rescue Ace from playing. Suddenly it's enough to stop your opponent from playing because you hit them with like an Ash or an Imperm or a Nib, and then you do that after, and suddenly that's good enough. So Labyrinth kind of breaks through the cycle of you can only play 9 to 12 really, really strong hand traps, because Labyrinth, just the entire deck, the freaking Furniture Labyrinth deck, essentially is engine plus hand traps. And I think that was one reason why the deck was so good. The only thing that, I mean, kind of throws me off of Lab, once again, Labyrinth was the deck I was probably the closest to playing if I didn't play the Bestial Runic deck. The reason why I didn't was because Ash is really good against the deck, like absurdly strong against Lab. And the Unchained matchup is really, really hard. And Unchained is pretty damn popular. It was pretty damn popular. Those are the two reasons why I decided against playing Labyrinth, but still, I can definitely see why it performed so well. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I think if Dinka Bui, I've seen Dinka Bui's list, we're gonna talk about it in a second, and his list I think is freaking genius once again. If Dinka Bui doesn't play specifically against like an unwinnable matchup like freaking Runic Bestial, like if I don't get paired up against Dinka Bui in top 4, he probably wins the tournament with his Labyrinth list. So that I think Labyrinth was a phenomenal pick for this event. We have Tearlament performing. I mean, Tearlament does Tearlament things, you know. Deck is kind of absurd still. I mean, it just gets there, man. It just gambas its way to victory. I feel like it's a good deck. I don't know, man. I was glad I was playing a deck that had a good matchup against Tier. I didn't play against that many Tiers. I think it was only 1 or 2. My matchup against it was good, but like the cool thing about Tier, once again, like I mean, every single deck in this pie chart has its pros and cons, right? But like Tier specifically is one of those decks that it doesn't actually play that much non-engine, doesn't have the room to play like the typical 9 to 12 hand traps. But Tier is one of those decks that going second, the matchup doesn't really matter. As long as you gamba them to death, you can beat everything, right? Like you can beat everything with Tearlaments, which is also a cool appeal. On the flip side, though, you can also lose to freaking everything, because if you don't gamba the right way, you know, tough luck, right? Which is like, Tearlament is fun. It's a comfort pick for a lot of people, but that kind of gamba aspect kind of throws me off of it right now. But yeah, that's that. And then Unchained. Unchained is still, I mean, 4th most represented deck in top 64 is strong. It's a strong showing for Unchained. But if you look at the stats in Swiss, right, where this one, right, Unchained and Rescue Ace basically entered this tournament at the same number, right? They both started at roughly the same number of duelists. However, somehow Rescue Ace ends up with 22% in top cut and Unchained only ends up with 9, right? So like, it's interesting, and I'm honestly not quite sure why that was. I don't know why that was, personally, for this event, because like I think Unchained was a solid pick, and I'm a little bit confused as to why that happened. I played against a lot of Unchained. It was like 3 or 4, but maybe it was just one of those issues where, you know, I know a lot of the good players switched to Lab or Rescue Ace. So maybe that was an issue for some of them. Also, I mean, the deck still runs a lot of one-off cards that you don't want to draw, which can impact the thing, but that was always the case. But I don't know. It's because you gatekept them. I did 2-0 every Unchained I faced because that matchup's pretty good for me, but I can't. That was not that many. That's not the only reason for sure. Well, yeah, I mean, Unchained just had a bad run at this YCS. I don't know if there's anything too deep about it. The deck is still good. I think it's a cool deck. I think it's just maybe a matter of, at this point in time, everyone respects Unchained. Everyone knows how the deck works. Like, it's probably, out of all the current, like, top decks here, like the top 5, 6, 7 decks, it's like the deck that people have been playing against the most, probably, for the last couple weeks. So that could be a thing, right? And then you know, yeah, I think Unchained is I think Unchained is still solid, and fourth most represented in Top Cut is still good, but the conversion rate was rather bad. So, and then we have two things I want to talk about, because I think it's very cool to see both Centurion and Fire King take up 6% in top 64, which I think equals four people out of top 64 on Fire King or Centurion is a pretty damn cool development, I think, because I personally would not have predicted this. You guys know, I mean, I've told you that I like Fire Kings and I like Centurion. When we tested both of these decks relatively extensively on stream, and I liked both of them. I told you, I think both of these have potential. I still would not have expected them to freaking top cut with 4 each at YCS Bologna. We're going to look at some of the lists later. I am pleasantly surprised by their performance. I knew they had potential. But I thought like maybe 1 or 2 were going to get top 64. But it was 4 each, which is very impressive. I mean, Centurion's advantage obviously is just the fact that Centurion is one of the decks that can play the most non-engine in the game if you want to. A lot of people have been pairing it up with Bystials as well, I think. And so Centurion Bystial, I mean, similar to Runic Bystial, if you play a deck with a lot of Bystials, I mean, Tier, Lab, and Unchained are going to be good for you. So I can see why that did well, you know. We're going to look at some of the Bystial Centurion lists in a bit. Basically just you play a lot of non-engine, you have very powerful normal summon in the Centurion cards, so if you ever play against someone with not a lot of hand traps, you can just cook them. Except for Runic decks, Centurion is not very good against Runic, because the Runics just stop your Crimson Dragon very consistently anyways. But like, you know, and then if you ever get stopped on your Primera, for example, you can still like summon a Bystial and make a level 10 synchro, which is cool. Or you can like summon a Lubellion and still make a level 12. I think that's good. I think that's good synergy. And then for Fire Kings, I think it's just a matter of... I think the deck was underestimated. Even I underestimated it a little bit, even though, like... The thing is just about Fire Kings, the Fire King deck simply doesn't have any fancy combos right now. Before Phantom Nightmare, the Fire King combos are very, very simple, very straightforward, but they're just effective. Like the deck has very, very strong grind game. It's a very cool and grindy deck. I like it a lot. One small thing about Fire Kings is that it doesn't enable something like Typhon. Like the current version, I lost to Fire Kings in Swiss in round 10. And that the turn 1 board that they make usually just doesn't even let your opponent summon Typhon, because they don't really summon from the extra deck at all. And that can be an advantage. But yeah, that's that. And then we have Pearly at 6%, which is a decent conversion rate. I'm gonna be honest with you, I was scared of Pearly. I was lucky that I didn't see a single one. Because if Pearly goes first, it can still, you know, be very, very scary. It has very good lines going second. I don't love Pearly right now because I think Pearly it feels very gambly against hand traps. Like, for example, if you open the field spell, suddenly Imperm and Veiler are really, really bad against your deck. But if you don't open the field spell, like Imperm on Pearl Lily, just freaking, you want to cry. So, like, and Veiler is also really good against it then. Ash is good against it. Like, not insane, but good. Crow is good against it, and that card was popular. So, I don't know. Pearly seems like you have to get a little bit lucky through all the hand traps, but the deck is good. So, I see why it still was there. But yeah, that's like my thoughts on the most represented decks in Top Cut at YCS Bologna. I think a lot of it makes sense the way it turned out, and is pretty much down to what I expected. The only thing I didn't really expect was Unchained doing relatively badly. I thought it was going to be slightly better than that. Basically, I expected a little bit less Rescue Ace, a little bit more Unchained. And I would have guessed like maybe 2 or 3 Fire King / Centurions and not 4 each. That's a little bit... They over-exceeded my expectations for sure. But that's a good thing. I'm happy about that. Even though Centurion obviously is a Crimson Dragon into Calamity kind of deck, that's Troll Despair. I still like the Centurion cards a lot, so that's that.